guess we are good to start.
Thanks.
Okay. So a warm good evening to everyone from Life Science Education Trust. I am Maya, your host for the webinar today, and I would like to invite all of you with pleasure to this webinar. So at LSeT, we are a specialized skill development training institute which focuses on animal care, management, research, and development. We offer comprehensive hands-on training programs, including one-year diploma in animal care and management and animal care bootcamp. The next intake is in January 2026. For any further details, you may please contact in the numbers given below. So today's topic for the webinar is keeping pangolins in European zoos. We are honored to welcome Mr. Johannes Pfleiderer, our speaker for today, who is a curator at Leipzig Zoo. Mr. Pfleiderer holds a BSc in biology and master's in organismic, evolutionary, and paleobiology. He joined Duisburg Zoo in 2015 as a zoological assistant and quickly advanced to head of zoology. During this time, he coordinated the European ex situ program for the Malagasy fossa and served as the vice chair of ESA's Small Mammal Taxon Advisory Group. Since joining Leipzig Zoo in 2021, he has been deeply involved in the husbandry of pangolins, the first to be housed in European zoos. His expertise has led to strong global collaborations in this specialized field. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our speaker, and I would like to hand over the virtual stage to him. Over to you, sir. You can please share your screen now and start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Maya, for the kind introduction. Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you all online in this webinar, and I'm glad to give you a lecture about keeping pangolins in European zoos. I will both address the historical aspects, because there have been holdings of pangolins even before the current ones at Leipzig Zoo and Prague Zoo. But there will be also a clear focus on the current husbandry of Chinese pangolins, which are the only species currently kept in European zoos, and which have been the only species kept in the past 18 years. Initially, I will give a short overview of the structure of my talk. I will go through the different pangolin species kept in Europe until now. Then give a more detailed overview by species of their historical representation in European collections. Summarize the overall situation of pangolin keeping, also with a historical aspect. Give an overview of the origin of pangolins in Europe, their longevity, the diet development, which is a key focus of pangolin husbandry, and then move over to the current European pangolin holdings, which are 2 at the moment. And then I will proceed to the management side and give a short insight about pangolins in the regional collection plan of the EASA's Small Mammal Taxon Advisory Group, of which I'm one of the vice chairs.
So if I may interrupt, have you started sharing your screen?
I have done it. So sorry once again.
Yeah.
But something apparently didn't work. Do you see it now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, perfect. I just have to go back. So
yes.
I think now, okay, perfect. So let's move on to the points. So that's the points I've mentioned up to now. And then I will proceed to the pangolin management in a global context, because for the past about 2.5 years, a global working group has formed to synchronize the efforts in different parts of the world, and then end with the conclusion, references, and the pictorial references. So to start with the pangolin species kept in Europe until now. Pangolins have always been and are still rare animals in human care. Why is that? And if you look back in the literature, there's a nice historical quote in the magazine Zoological Garden, which is one of the oldest magazines about animal care of a German researcher at that time working in China and studying pangolins there. And after doing so, his resume was, therefore, the pangolins are hardly tempting for the animal keeper due to their poor intelligence, their nocturnal activity, and their challenging nutrition. Their interesting body structure and their phylogeny are pretty much the only two aspects making them appealing for researchers. To study these, ultimately, specimens preserved in alcohol would be sufficient. So I think this historical quote pretty much sums up why pangolins joined zoological collections fairly late. But in the end, they still did. So overall, over the years and pretty much centuries, most of the pangolin species have been kept in European collections. So the Indian pangolin was, which is critically endangered according to the IRIS and Red List. The Sunda pangolin was kept, also critically endangered. The Chinese pangolin, also critically endangered, was kept and still is, including at my institution. The black-bellied pangolin from Africa, which is for now still vulnerable, was kept. The white-bellied pangolin, endangered, was kept. The giant ground pangolin, also from Africa and also endangered, was kept. And the Temminck's pangolin from Eastern and Southern Africa, also vulnerable, was kept. So all kind of traditional pangolin species, but one, which is the Philippine pangolin, of which there are no records of any historical keeping in Europe, were kept in Europe. But if you followed taxonomic publications, you might have noticed that there were two recent descriptions of new pangolin species, bringing up the total number to 10. One is the cryptic pangolin, which was described 2 years ago from seed scales in China, and the origin of these scales is uncertain. There's assumptions of some colleagues working with pangolins that these scales might originate from the phenotypically distinct pangolins from Java, which are for now still subsumed under the Sunda pangolin. So in the end, this might be the hidden origin of the species, but it still has to be confirmed. And early this year, the Indo-Burmese pangolin was described, which was a split of the Chinese pangolin and the formerly Western populations of the species from Nepal, India, and northwestern Myanmar are now assigned to this new species. And you can see the two publications. One of them is also open access, and I also have the link in the references in the end. So both these species could historically have been kept in Europe under a different name, but it would be hard to confirm their existence because it would require detailed records of their origin or preserved specimens in museums to do a genetic test. So it will most likely stay unclear if they have been kept in the past. But now let's proceed to the known historical representation of pangolins in Europe. The Indian pangolin has been fairly rarely kept. There's two clearly confirmed historical holdings, Stuttgart in Germany and Antwerp in Belgium. And there's some evidence in the literature about a historical holding at Prague Zoo, but so far it could not be confirmed with the records of the zoo. However, some of the historical holdings of European collections have gaps for different reasons, so it would still require some more investigation. The two confirmed holdings were in the 1960s and 70s. The assumed holding in Prague around 1969, according to a historical book, but not confirmed. And only Antwerp Zoo kept the species for several years, whereas the holding in Stuttgart was quite short. So in total, 8 individuals were kept between 1967 and 1973. There was even, right at the beginning of the holding period, one birth, and there's a historical photo. Unfortunately, not a very good quality, but technology was different at that time. at least there's some evidence preserved. And this offspring was born from a pregnant wild-caught female shortly after arrival at Antwerp Zoo. And quite remarkable, if you will also see in the next overviews about the other species, this young female lived for more than 10 months, which was quite an achievement at that time. And about the second confirmed holding at Stuttgart Zoo, it is recorded that they were housed in a nocturnal house in a mixed exhibit with flying foxes and short-beaked echidnas. And the specimen kept there at that time is still preserved at the local museum. And you can see a photo of the individual in alcohol, which could also confirm the right identification of the species. But in total, the Indian pangolin was a rare guest at European zoos. This was a bit different for the Sunda pangolin. As you can see on the map, there have been significantly more historical holdings. Again, mainly from Central Europe, from Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, also from Czech Republic and from London Zoo. So in total, 6 institutions. The first records date back from the 1920s, so almost at the beginning of the historical period of pangolins appearing occasionally at European zoos. And the first zoos to keep them were London and Rotterdam Zoo. The majority of the animals were kept in the 1960s and 70s, and most of them were kept shortly or very shortly. However, a pair 1.1 were kept in Antwerp for about 6 years between 1973 and 78 and 79 respectively, which was for a long time the husbandry record regarding the longevity of captive pangolins in Europe. One individual, which was also a bit outstanding regarding the husbandry period, was a male kept at Krefeld Zoo. There's also a historical photo preserved in the archive taken by the director at the time, Walter Enke, which was at least kept for 1.5 years, which was significantly longer than most of the other pangolins kept at Europe at that time. However, for this species, there have not been any birth records, so no births of frequently imported females, so no records at all. And again, there's some documentation in the literature about a mixed exhibit, this time in Amsterdam, with sugar gliders, like in Stuttgart, in a nocturnal house. And nocturnal houses were starting to become popular at that time, so quite a number of European zoos built them in the 1960s. Now let's move on to the Chinese pangolin. As mentioned before, this is the only species currently maintained at European zoos. There's also a number of historical holdings, again, with a clear focus on Central Europe. Also, again, London Zoo, Riga Zoo in Latvia, which is a bit out of the core region of pangolin holders. And there's also a non-confirmed record in literature about a historical holding in Vienna. So in total, 8 zoos with records of pangolin holdings, one of them questionable. The first record was at London Zoo in 1925. And afterwards, they've been occasionally kept over a couple of decades on the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. The photo on the right was taken in the mid-1980s at Prague Zoo. There was one stillbirth in Antwerp in 1970, again from a pregnant wild-caught female after import. And the last, at that time, so unsuccessful attempts to establish them were in the 1990s, both in Riga with the subspecies Auritus from Vietnam, and in Wuppertal in Germany with the nominate subspecies from Taiwan. And after these animals had died after a fairly short husbandry period, there was a long break until my zoo, Leipzig Zoo, restarted keeping the species in late 2007. and obtained the first individual from Taipei Zoo in Taiwan in December 2007. This male is still alive to this date. In total, 2.2, so 2 pairs were moved to Leipzig Zoo. All of them were rescued animals with a not exactly known age, because some of them were rescued as an adult individual, so we cannot exactly tell how old they were when they were rescued by the staff at Taipei Zoo, and 1.1 of them are still alive to this date. And yeah, there has been a close collaboration with Taipei Zoo, which has been working a lot on improving pangolin husbandry, and Taipei Zoo really provided the basis also for the current European holders to keep pangolins ultimately long-term in European care. As a second holder, Prague Zoo started with a pair of pangolins, again, the nominate subspecies from Taiwan, in 2022 in a nocturnal house. You can see one photo at the bottom. I will show some more later at this talk. And in early February 2023, there was the first ever captive conceived birth of any pangolin species in Europe at Prague Zoo of this pair. All other births which were recorded in the past of various species were always conceived in the wild. The females were brought to Europe pregnant and gave birth to the offspring here. And 1st of July last year, there was a second birth at Prague Zoo, also again a female. So this first breeding success could be repeated in the meantime. Before going back to that in a bit more detail, I will continue with a historical overview of the holding of the African species. First of all, the black-bellied pangolin, which is a very arboreal species. There are 6 historical holdings, again, all of them in Central Europe. The first ones date back from the 1920s, but most of them in the 1950s and 60s, when there were many expeditions to Africa and when it was still fairly easy to bring back animals from there to Europe, because there have not been the current veterinary restrictions. So it was fairly easy to go there and bring back animals and keep them in zoos or in private institutions. There's quite few historical photos because most of the animals were kept shortly or very shortly, so the longevity of the species was pretty poor. This is a historical photo from Prague Zoo. Also for this species, there were no birth records, and in total, the documentation is quite poor. The white-bellied pangolin, which is also arboreal but not as strictly as the other species, is the pangolin species with most historical records in European zoos. You can see that on the map. So in total, 12 institutions are documented to have kept them in the past. Also in countries like Spain, for example, which have no records of the other species we talked about before. It was also the species for which there's the earliest historical record. So already in 1877, London Zoo. Obviously, at that time there was a close connection between Africa, where there was a large British colonial empire, and London Zoo, which obtained animals caught in these areas. So also pangolins arrived already at that time. However, the majority of the holdings were, again, like for the previous species, in the 1950s and 60s. And since there were more holdings, there's also some more historical photos preserved. This, for example, is a white-bellied pangolin, which was obtained from a market on a German expedition to Cameroon in the 50s, and afterwards brought back to Germany, again to Stuttgart Zoo, and lived there for a few weeks. These are photos from Antwerp Zoo, which for a long time had the most developed pangolin holdings. And in 1962, there was also a birth at Cologne Zoo in Germany from a pregnant wild-caught female. Then after the 1960s, there were only very few records. And in the 1990s, there was again one male kept at Rotterdam and Arnhem Zoo for more than 4 years, which was quite a significantly long time. And this animal came from a confiscation. And the very last record was in Paris Zoo. Again, animals from confiscations. Two males were kept there from 2006 to 2007, not fully a year, just a couple of months before they died. So it still shows that at that time, pangolin husbandry was still not that well developed and quite challenging. There's also quite a number of historical records of the larger species, the giant ground pangolin, which can weigh up to 35 kilograms. Also a species from Central Africa mainly. So in total, 11 records. One of them is a bit questionable. The first one dates back from 1949, so right after World War II. But again, also for this species, most of the records are from the 1960s, a time when European zoos received many imports from Central Africa. Also for some species which are now quite well established in our collections, for example, gorillas, okapis or bonobos, and pangolins occasionally were some kind of bycatch in these imports. And it's also quite well documented that if, for example, there was a direct import by plane, the zoo directors organizing these transport tried to make them as efficient as possible. And besides the main target species, they also tried to obtain some smaller species. Also for this species, most of the animals didn't survive that long, but two individuals were a bit outstanding and they were kept between 3.5 and 4 years in Antwerp Zoo in Belgium and Copenhagen Zoo at the turn of the 1950s and 60s and in the early mid 60s. And the photos again are from Antwerp Zoo, which is quite a nice archive. And about 20 years ago, a nice article was published in the German Keeper magazine, summing up the historical records and some pictures of that time. And in 1968, there was also one birth at Amsterdam Zoo, of which there are also some nice historical photographs. But unfortunately, also this offspring didn't live for that long. And the last records of the species in European care were in the late 1970s in Paris Zoo. Compared to the previous species, the Hemmings pangolin, a savanna species from eastern and southern Africa, was fairly rarely represented. There's two quite well documented and confirmed holdings from London and Basel Zoo in Switzerland, and the questionable one from Duisburg Zoo in Germany, which is just documented by some historical article. So they were quite rare, and again, it's a species which was quite early kept. So the first record was in 1896 at London Zoo, and the other two records are from the 1950s. Of the individual in Basel, there's also interesting historical article because in 1953, also for this species, there was a birth from a pregnant wild-caught female, but the youngster only survived for 1 week. But at least there's quite some nice documentation. Unfortunately, many zoos didn't publish about their experiences in the past, but at least some of them did. So we can a bit trace back the development of keeping and maybe some of the mistakes done in the past, for which the species could not be established already back then in European collections. So to give a kind of summary of the historical pangolin keeping in Europe, the first pangolins already arrived in the late 19th century. The first ones all at London Zoo. Then there were some occasional holdings until the 1920s. Quite many in the 1950s and 70s, especially of the African species, due to the many import expeditions from Africa at that time. Around that time, there were the first births in several species, all of them from pregnant wild-caught females. And in this time, there were the first animals which could be kept successfully for several years, which was a clear advance compared to the previous attempts where most of the animals died within days, weeks, or a few months. In the 1960s and 70s, we could see a shift more to Asian species. However, at the time, the longevity of these animals was still often short. And Antwerp Zoo was the clear leader in keeping pangolins in Europe. Over the decades, they kept at least 27 individuals of 5 different species. In the 1980s, there's only a record of one single holding. So pangolins were gradually phased out of European collections, most likely because of the poor success of the previous holdings. And in the 1990s, there was again unsuccessful attempts to establish a Chinese pangolin at Riga and Wuppertal Zoo. In 2007, the first Chinese pangolin arrived at Leipzig Zoo, which is, as I mentioned, still alive today. And after this holding at Leipzig could be kept up for almost 2 decades, in 2022, Prague Zoo, a second holder, started with a pair of Chinese pangolins. And in 2023, there was the first captive conceived birth of any pangolin at Prague Zoo. Now a short overview of the origin of pangolins in European zoos. Many, at least those were documented, came from dealers, especially in the 60s and 70s, where some animal dealers expanded their activity and became the key players for animal transactions between zoos. Especially before that time, in the 1950s and 60s, many were brought back by researchers, some even by tourists. It's even documented in some of the zoo's archives that that people were on holidays in Africa, went to a market, bought a pangolin, and managed to bring it back alive, which would be impossible nowadays due to the veterinary restrictions for animal movements, but it was still possible at the time. And up to the early 1990s, even occasionally still by sailors. So the animal I mentioned before in the Netherlands in the 1990s was brought by sailors from a West African port and then lived at 2 Dutch zoos for 2 years. Later on, there was also a number of confiscations, especially in more recent years, and animals were then handed over to zoos. The animals in the 1990s, some of them arrived in the course of animal exchanges. So, for example, the pangolins that came to Wuppertal Zoo. And the recent examples are transfers which result from coordinated efforts, and Taipei Zoo in Taiwan is still the key partner for European zoos to advance their pangolin holdings. And the animals which came from there are both rescued wild-caught individuals. The main issue for pangolins in Taiwan is not the illegal trade, because they are quite well protected there, but it's mainly animals which are victim of traffic accidents and of stray dogs, which are a clear problem in Taiwan, and some of them cannot be released again, and they will then be kept in Taipei Zoo, and some of them have been handed over to other collections. But 2 of the animals in Europe, the breeding pair in Prague, have already been captive bred. So Taipei Zoo has been breeding the species since the 1990s. And so the offspring of this pair in Prague are already F2 individuals. I will now continue with the overview of the longevity of the different species in European zoos. So one Indian pangolin was kept for more than 3 years at Antwerp Zoo. Sunda pangolin was kept for in the mid-late 1970s for a bit more than 6 years, which was for a long time the husbandry record for Europe. As I mentioned, one of the the first Chinese pangolin which arrived to Leipzig Zoo in late 2007 is still alive today. So it has been kept for 17 years and 9 months, which is by far the husbandry record for the species in Europe. And this individual is most likely also now in the top 10 of the animals globally for the longest time in captivity. For the black-bellied pangolin, there's no detailed longevity records. Some of the documentation was quite poor, but obviously most of these individuals only lived for a few days, weeks, or at most a month or two in captivity. For the white-bellied pangolin, the mentioned confiscated individual in Rotterdam and Arnhem Zoo lived for a bit more than 4 years. The giant ground pangolin, also a bit more than 4 years. Unfortunately, the detailed dates of transfers are not exactly documented, but it's just roughly, so it's about 4 years. And for the Tennings pangolin, there's a literature record for historical holding in Duisburg Zoo, also a place where I worked in the past. However, the animal registry in these years is not that good, so it could not be confirmed. And this husband record of about 5 years is quite questionable. And if it's not true, then the longevity of the other individuals in London and Basel is significantly shorter, just a few months. Now about the diets. Since they are specialists in their nutrition with a focus on termites and ants, and also quite some and intra-specific variation about the share of the different species they feed on. It's quite challenging, and it's one key aspect and also one key challenge of keeping them. If you look into their historical diets, there's usually no or limited availability of suitable food insects. And there's some documentation about historical diets and nutrition plans. Excuse me. And I will give you some examples. So Antwerp Zoo used a mash of minced meat, eggs, dog pellets, cereal wheat powder, wheat germ oil, ant eggs, condensed milk, cornflakes, vitamin supplements, and hot water. Compared to some other historical diet plans, it's already quite advanced in the diversity, and also due to the fact that with ant eggs, at least some insect component was already added at that time. If you, for example, compare the diet in Stuttgart, it was just a mash of minced meat, raw eggs, milk, oat flakes, vitamin and mineral supplements. So with today's perspective, this diet was by far less appropriate. Basel Zoo used a mash of chopped mealworms, boiled cockroaches, minced horse meat, raw eggs, and cooked oat porridge. And Prague Zoo, in their historical holdings, used a mash of raw mincemeat, beef broth, raw egg yolk, milk powder, oat porridge, mealworms, ant larvae, vitamin and mineral supplements, salt, and glucose powder. Also here, it's already a quite good nutrition. However, if you, as you will see later, the diet nowadays is quite different. And in Riga, which is still a fairly recent example from the mid-1990s. They used the mesh of puppy food, minced beef meat, glucose, and crickets. So now about our diet in Leipzig Zoo. The food ration is prepared at the central food kitchen of the zoo in our nutrition department for 1 week. And then the portions for the individuals are frozen and defrozen on a daily basis. And then there's just the daily final processing by the keepers, mainly by adding minerals and healing earth as an important component. And then it's finally prepared in these dog enrichment food bowls and presented to the animals. There's one feeding at 1:30 p.m. and below you can see the finally prepared food bowls. The two animals receive a specific portion according to their weight. So the male is a bit heavier, gets a little more, and depending on their status, the amount given daily is adjusted. And the daily feeding is also the main activity phase for the animals. And besides the food, they have a water bowl and enclosure which is daily cleaned and refilled. So they have always access, and we can often see them drinking after the feeding. This is the recipe of our diet. So it was developed and adjusted over the years, and it's based on the Taipei Zoo diet with some adaptations according to the availability of certain items in Europe. So obviously, for the consistency, there's quite an amount of water there. The most important component are bee larvae. Initially, we received them freshly and had to get them or prepare them on our own. Nowadays, you can obtain them frozen, which is much easier for our nutrition department. As a second insect component, we added mealworms. We also add apples, which is also something Taipei Zoo developed over the decades of experience with the species. Egg yolk. And then there's a couple of supplements, as you can see in the list. One important one is also chitin powder, because the carapaxes of the wild ants and termites contain a lot of chitin, and we have to imitate this in the captive diet. And some of the supplements are given in every feeding. Some, like the omega-3 supplements, are just added once per week. And one important aspect is also the healing earth, which is added because in the wild, when pangolins are taking up the ants with their sticky tongue, they are taking up some parts of the soil, and this is apparently necessary for the digestion. So if you don't imitate that in captivity, in the end, the digestion isn't working well, and the feces are not looking good. And after adding these issues could be solved. Besides the recipe, we also did some adaptations to the feeding bowls over the years. There's an old photo from 2013. So after about 6 years of pangolin keeping, at that time, we still just used regular bowls. And nowadays with the enrichment bowls, the pangolins spend much more time on feeding. So also in the wild, taking up all the ants and termites takes quite some time. And so we would like to imitate that, and also to keep them active for a longer time. Because if they are not looking for food, pangolins tend to sleep or to hide for most of the day. And with these feeding bowls, our male sometimes spends up to 40 minutes in feeding, and this also prolongs the time our visitors can see the animals. Prague Zoo also adjusted the diet from Taipei Zoo to their needs, so pretty much similar to our conditions. There's just basically two major differences. Since they have more pangolins at this point, 4 individuals, they are preparing the food ratio on a daily basis directly at the small mammal departments from the ingredients and not centrally like we do in a nutrition department. They found out that even the apple variety matters. So when they did their first apples, they had to change the apple variety because the pangolin's acceptance of the food was pretty poor. But yeah, if you imagine how different apples can taste, this is not very much surprising. We apparently picked the right apple variety in the past when we did the first uh, diets. And what they also do differently is they are feeding them twice daily. This is also what Taipei Zoo does. And in the future, with new animals, we will also move over uh, to a feeding at least twice daily. But since our animals are or have been kept this way for more than 70 years, we will not, for now, change it for these old individuals. And Prague Zoo also uses dog enrichment food bowls, which are a bit different, but which serve the same purpose. Now, about the current European pangolin holdings, I will a bit present the enclosures and the situation. First, about our own institution. In Leipzig Zoo, the pangolins are kept in the basement of the elephant house. The elephant house in Leipzig Zoo is almost 100 years old. It was built in 1926. And then about 20 years ago, there was a complete reconstruction and an enlargement of the house, which was opened in 2006. And the pangolins are situated in the enlargement of the house. So this part is not an historical building. It was just added as a new side wing to the historical building. And on the left side, you can see the underwater viewing area of our inside elephant pool. And in between, there's a bamboo wall to avoid reflections. And on the right side, you can see the pangolin enclosure. This photo was taken in the early morning when it's still illuminated, and over the day, it goes into nocturnal light mode. Initially, this enclosure was inhabited by a Sri Lankan giant squirrel. Actually, even the individual you can see on the right picture, it's a photo from 2006. And after the death of this individual, which was moved over from a Czech zoo and was pretty old, this enclosure was adapted for pangolins in 2007 due to the good connections of our zoo and especially our director with Taipei Zoo, which led to the option to acquire the species for our zoo. The total area is about 46 square meters, including 2 boxes, and the room the pangolins are kept in is about 2.8 meters tall. And the total enclosure is divided by an artificial stilt road, and it's therefore connected, separated in two connectable parts. And the left part has about 17 square meters of ground area. And as you can see on the right photo, the rear part, the bit broader part of the stilt route, is connected with a tube, and we can close it by some kind of cap if you want to separate the animals. And the right part also is about 17 square meters. So basically the stilt route, since it's quite broad in the back, takes some of the area of the total room. And there's more water basins in both enclosures. Originally, there were boxes at opposite sides of each enclosure, sleeping boxes, a bit less than a square meter and a square meter large. They're still there, but no longer used because already some years back, the pangolins did no longer really use them. And historically, we also had cameras inside these boxes. So if the pangolins were retreating to sleep, the visitors could at least see them on the screen. You can see that on the lower left picture. And as you can imagine, the technology in 2007 was not that advanced, so the footage was rather poor. And then this was something we had to change over the years. And a couple of years ago, the pangolins moved. Initially, they slept in the rear part of the enclosure behind some logs. But then, about 2.5, 3 years ago, they moved to a platform in the rear area of the enclosure. And this is quite handy for us because we could install a new camera on top of that. And with the current technology, even in a dark enclosure and with a new monitor, people can see them pretty well, even when the enclosure is fully dark. And so, usually all the time, people can at least see on a screen sleeping pangolin in quite resolution. There's also some more cameras inside the enclosure. Like on the lower left picture, you can see one above the entrance door for the keepers, but they are only used to be able to check the nocturnal activity of the animals. So they are only used um, for our staff and just to be able to check the activity of the pangolins at the time no staff is working with them. Here's some more photos of the upper levels of the enclosure because historically there were some enclosure mates, well, there still are some, but no larger ones. So between 2019 and 23, we had a surplus male pygmy slow lorry kept with the species because, yeah, at that time it could not be accommodated within the breeding program for the slow lorries, but it left in 2023. Afterwards, we had a pair of slender lorries in there, which also worked well because the upper levels are not used by our pangolins, most likely because they're quite old and cannot climb that well anymore. Unfortunately, we lost both slender lorries, one of them due to cancer and one due to anesthesia, which didn't go well. So as of now, we have no other mammals with them. Here's a photo of the slender lorry. We kept tokay geckos in there, mainly for cockroach control, for 7 years. And at the moment, we still have a common toad in there, which also addresses a bit the cockroach issue, because in a tropical house with a wood chip floor and yeah, different nutrition items, especially the pangolin food, you can hardly do something against cockroaches. And obviously, we can also not use any poison because it would be a threat to the pangolins. Now about education. Obviously, one aspect is the enclosure sign, which is bilingual, so in German and English in our case, and gives some fundamental information about the species, its nutrition, the habitat, reproduction, and some fun facts. But beside this initial education piece, we also have some information panels and the whole corridor on both sides, and they are mainly addressing the topic of pangolin trade and the pangolin diversity in general. So the left side says they are the most trafficked mammals in the world, and on the right side we have an overview of species, but obviously still the 8 traditional species, so the 2 recently described species are not listed there yet. And also mainly because one of the species has not been assigned to a distribution area yet, but this might be updated in due course. Now to our individuals. There's 2 individuals kept at the moment in Leipzig Zoo, the male Feng, which is the record holder for pangolin longevity in Europe. It arrived on 21st December 2007. That's a photo which was taken in April this year, when I was taking myself care of the pangolins for a couple of days. You can see that the scales of this animal are not looking that well anymore, but as mentioned, he is very old. He arrived at Taipei Zoo as an adult individual, was kept there for about a year, and then came to us. So based on that information, he is at least 20 years old, but he could be even older. And the female Kei-san, also a rescued individual, arrived on 1st of December 2009. And here you can see a photo of both of them together. So most of the time they are kept together. We are only separating them during feeding because, as mentioned before, both individuals receive a specific amount of food, and we want to make sure that they are taking up only the food which is supposed for each of them. And as mentioned also before, the male feeds much slower. So if you would not separate them, the female would come over and steal some of his food. So I hope this video will work. Uh, Apparently not. Yeah, there's a short video. So sometimes we see some interaction of this species, but we can see with increasing age also in the time I've been working there. So I've been now working at the zoo for 4.5 years. The activity is decreasing, and yeah, we also have to assume that at some point soon, those very old individuals will come to an end of their lifetime. So, but something like 2, 3 years ago, we could also see some mating attempts, but this is no longer observed. So there were also two other individuals kept at our zoo, a male which arrived in December 2016 from Taipei Zoo. There, it had been kept for 8 years before, but then it died at our zoo in January 2020. Probably also due to old age because it already arrived at quite a high age. This male was found fairly freshly dead, so we could create a mounted specimen. And a female also arrived in the same transport. She was already kept at Taipei Zoo for 11 years, and she also died shortly afterwards. And since our other enclosure only has capacity for 2 individuals, we kept those individuals behind the scenes in our quarantine building for mammals. That's an example of set now when it's used for breeding animals of pygmy slow lories, so connectable compartments. And for the time the animals were kept there, it worked pretty well, and the accommodation of some of the breeding animals at Taipei Zoo is pretty similar. Now, a short glimpse at Prague Zoo, the second holding in Europe. They also converted an existing enclosure for their pangolins. They rebuilt their nocturnal animal area in their Asian tropical hall and dedicated initially 3, later 4 enclosures for the species. So there are some differences to our setup, whereas our enclosure is just a divided room and the airspace is the same. The enclosures in Prague Zoo are completely independent. They can be connected, but there are 4 different units. And they also have a different layout of the boxes, which was also derived from some recent example from Taipei. So as you can see in the middle and right, there's boxes towards the visitors, and they are working quite well. So I've been in Prague Zoo 3 times since they got the pangolins, and almost all the time you could see a pangolin at least sleeping in the box. They are quite dark, but it works quite well. And even the breeding female, which is in the middle picture, is sleeping in a box towards the visitors. And from the rear part, you can open them for management and handling. At the moment, there's 4 individuals there, so the original pair and 2 female offspring, and the offspring are supposed to be moved over to new holders once they are ready. So about pangolin management. For a long time, there was no management frame for pangolins because there were virtually none in European collections. But since there has been a continuous pangolin holding in Europe now since 2007, they were also part of the regional collection planning workshop of the Small Mammal Taxon Advisory Group of the European Zoo Association. And this was held for the subgroups Sinatra, so sloths and eaters armadillos, and Voidota, so pangolins at Frankfurt Zoo in Germany in mid-May 2022. And this meeting, which was in the late COVID years, was a hybrid meeting. It was attended both by in situ and ex situ experts, and this facilitation was taken over by the EASA executive office. And in this meeting, which I also attended, there was a decision to establish a European ex situ program for pangolins. And since these programs are no longer only focused on captive management only, there's two pillars. There's the ex situ focus on Chinese pangolins and Sunda pangolins. You might be surprised why there's two species mentioned with only one species present in Europe. But the fact is that both Taipei Zoo and Singapore Zoo are associate members of EASA, and since Singapore Zoo keeps Sunda pangolins in the association, so beyond the geographical borders of Europe, there's also a second species in captive care. And it was also decided that this EEP should be jointly coordinated by Taipei Zoo and Singapore Zoo as the two institutions with most experience and success in pangolin keeping and breeding. And as a second pillar, there should also be an in situ focus on other species, especially on African species, in clear connection with in situ experts for these species. And that's an excerpt of the species sheets, which were the basis for this workshop. And in the end, it led to a protocol. And after some delay due to some staff changes in the office, which did all the sum up of this workshop, finally, in April last year, the regional collection plan could be published. And there's now a clear program decision statement for the pangolin EP, which sums up the roles, why this program has been combined, and also the focus on these two mentioned species for the ex situ part. And beyond the European work, there's also now an increasing global network. So in February 2023, not that long after this workshop, there was a pangolin workshop for in situ and ex situ conservation at Babanango Reserve in South Africa. The main initiative came from Vienna Zoo, but also my zoo covered parts of the funding for some attendees to come there. And we had people from 4 different continents attending there, so from Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America. And it was really interesting to see what the other stakeholders are doing about pangolin conservation and care. And the clear goal is to have a closer collaboration between the regions, especially with the North American Pangolin Consortium. North American zoos are keeping and breeding the white-bellied pangolins I had mentioned before, and some of their achievements, especially in their veterinary work, were quite remarkable for us. And I think we can mutually benefit from exchanging experience there. There's now also a closer link with the RSCN Pangolin Specialist Group, since many of the institute specialists were attending. And there's a follow-up event planned for 2026 with a focus on Chinese pangolins. And at the moment, there's some preparatory meetings to have a hopefully successful second meeting in about a year. So, to come to a conclusion, pangolins have always been a niche group of animals in European zoos. There has been an occasional holdings in a rather small number of zoos over the decades. The last 2 decades have shown that pangolins can be maintained long-term in European collections. There has been a constant improvement of husbandry, but this is mainly thanks to the fundamental knowledge gained and generously shared by the colleagues in Taipei Zoo, which have been working very intensely in researching and improving the standards for pangolins there. And there has been a recent breakthrough regarding captive breeding in Europe, which could now even be repeated. And there's now a community of dedicated zoos to further expand pangolin involvement. And the main driver there is Vienna Zoo, and this is also supposed to be the third European holder. But there are some other zoos involved, for example, Frankfurt and Berlin. So hopefully in a couple of years, we will see maybe half a dozen holdings in Europe. And the second hope is that the success of Prague Zoo can also repeat it elsewhere, and that the captive collection will slowly but gradually increase. The European LSeT program under the leadership of Taipei Zoo will provide a framework to further establish and expand this small captive population. And if we look back in history, there's also some species which are nowadays quite well established, which achieved this breakthrough decades ago. There's quite a remarkable book, The World of Zoos, published by a former curator of Frankfurt Zoo in 1966. And there was a double page about 2 very popular species, the aardvark from Africa and the maned wolf. And in 1966, both of the species had never been successfully reproduced in captivity. But in the very same year, for the first time, Amsterdam Zoo bred them, and you can see here an overview, the census of the captive collection, and you can see afterwards the population went up. And a year after the publication of this book, Frankfurt Zoo achieved the world first successful breeding of the maned wolf, and you can see how the population developed since then. So I am very optimistic that after the first breeding, we will eventually see the same picture in pangolins, and hopefully in a few decades, the population will be solid and stable, and we can ensure a long-term viable insurance population of the species. These are my references for this talk. And Victoria sources, thank you for all the colleagues in providing material. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm welcome to get back to any questions.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful session. Now to the participants, if you have any questions, you may please unmute yourself and ask your questions.
If anyone has any question, yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, I do have to ask. Is there a reason why you guys in Leipzig weren't able to breed them while Prague was able to breed them? Just out of curiosity.
It's a good question. We have also wondered ourselves. We think after visiting, so both I and some of our pangolin keepers have visited Prague Zoo. So their setup is pretty much similar. We think that probably just the breeding animals there were more suitable. They received animals which were captive bred, known age, and they also had reproduced at Taipei Zoo before. So most likely, our animals just have some deficiency which keeps them from breeding. So we are quite optimistic since our fundamental conditions are pretty similar, both regarding nutrition, housing, that with new animals which are supposed to arrive in the future, we should be well able to also repeat the success in our zoo.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
Okay. So for the record, most of them like they kept shortly in the holding, right? Do you have the records? Why are they kept shortly are they die of natural causes or are they die because disease or something?
Well, there's not for the very historical holdings, the documentation is rather poor. But as I mentioned in the diet overview, many of these historical diets were not really suitable. If you feed them with for example, with a mesh of minced meat and oat flakes, um, the nutrients in there, the composition is pretty far from what we are feeding them now and from the natural diet. So it should be assumed that the diet at that time was just inappropriate. Some of the individuals which lasted longer were probably a bit more hardy. But if you look at the historical diets, for example, in Antwerp Zoo, where they were already feeding items like ant larvae, they already had longer longevity records than other holdings. So I think there's a clear correlation on feeding and longevity. And yeah, I think that most of the animals that died too early just did not survive on the food they were given. And another aspect is that many of these animals traveled quite long. So some of them were brought back on a ship from Africa. They most likely had some parasites. And so this is also an aspect that could have influenced the longevity.
Do we have any questions? Any more questions?
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hello. So can you explain how this organism is helpful in the ecosystem? Like what kind of role does it's doing?
Can you please once again their role in the ecosystem?
Yeah. What's the main role that is doing in ecosystem?
Well, basically, as I mentioned before, they almost entirely feed on termites and ants in the wild. It differs quite significantly. So on this ex situ workshop or in situ workshop, we saw some nice presentations on field researchers, even in the same species. The composition can vary a lot in different range parts. But yeah, as you know, ants and termites are quite powerful players in the past and can influence ecosystems. So it is quite essential that they have some predators controlling them. And I was on a study visit at our partner in Taiwan at Taipei Zoo. And besides the captive management part or area, Taipei Zoo also comprises a nature reserve on about half of its area of about 40 hectares. And we went into the forest there, and you could see an incredible density in this safe environment of pangolin burrows. So, especially in these tropical and subtropical areas, it's quite essential to have some predators for ants and termites to regulate the effect of especially termites on the vegetation. And I mean, there's a couple of other specialists feeding on ants and termites, but not too many. And in many parts of their distribution, pangolins are among the main control agents for ants and termites. And so if they are taken out by poaching, there's a regularly part for the ants and termites missing, and this can lead to quite some shifts in the ecosystem.
Any more questions? So I guess there are no more questions. So on behalf of the entire team of Life Science Education Trust, I would like to thank our speaker. It was an honor to have you today, and we hope your insights will inspire many of us to pursue this field with the same passion and dedication you bring. To all the participants of the webinar, thank you for being active participants. We request you to please fill the feedback form so that we can issue your participant certificates. The link to the feedback form is already shared in the chat box. Before we
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Before we conclude,
thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Before we conclude, I would love to remind you about the programs offered by LSeT, the one-year diploma in animal care and management, and the animal care bootcamp with the next intake in January 2026. So for any further details, please connect with us at the numbers mentioned below. Thank you everyone for joining. We look forward to seeing many of you take the next step in this journey with LSeT. Thank you and good night.